Data published by Statistics South Africa shows that the tourism industry has been hit hard by the country's coronavirus lockdown. Measured in nominal terms, total income for the tourist accommodation industry decreased by 95.3% in June 2020 compared with the previous year. So how has the closure of the hospitality industry impacted on the GDP? George Kershoff, Deputy Director at the Bureau for Economic Research, joins us to talk about this. George, good evening and thank you so much for your time. This time in 2019, if you look at the numbers, April, May, June 2019, 5.5 billion into the GDP. But if you look at the income at this time around, we're talking only 172 million. Tourism accommodation seriously plummets. What does this mean?
Yes, good evening, Tabu, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. It is certainly very worrying. We did a survey amongst hotels and restaurants at the end of May, and at that time we were still in lockdown stage 4. And all the participants in our survey rated prevailing business conditions as unsatisfactory. So we measure business confidence on a level from 100 to 0. So it indicates that nobody was satisfied. And given this steep fall you refer to in the nominal income generated from hotels, it is no surprise. The hotels and restaurants and other tourist facilities combined make up about 8% of GDP in South Africa. So it is not only the hotels and restaurants specifically, but also the links with other sectors in the economy. So a hotel will typically use washing facilities, it will use maintenance services. Likewise, in the tourism sector, you have transport, which is very important, both buses and land transport, but also air transport. So now that the local travel is allowed across borders, that is about 4.4% of GDP, and the fact that it will slowly pick up as limitations is reduced, that is certainly helpful. In the industry as a whole, 1.6 million people are employed, and I fear that during this 5 months that many hotels were closed, and especially restaurants, many of these will not have survived this and will unfortunately close down permanently. And we must also remember...
Talk to me, George, about those that have closed already. There are some businesses who weren't able to open, of course, in the 5 months. Unfortunately, they had to close and let go of their stuff. Will they be able to reopen now that the restrictions have been lifted somewhat?
It is difficult to answer. I suspect no. It will take a while for the whole industry to recover. And not all businesses rely only on domestic travel. In certain areas, foreign visitors play a big role, and they will only return when international borders open. The other factor is, even though the regulations are lifted, people's income are under huge pressure, and going on holiday, staying in a hotel or even some other accommodation, going out eating, that is in these times luxury.
So, I mean, comparing that, you're talking about the economic fallout of the pandemic and how that has impacted people and the likelihood that they will book a holiday. But following the president's announcements, for example, that parks will now be available, Park tells us that they are computer crashed because of the demand. Is there this pent-up demand in South Africans to want to go out and travel at this point? And is that going to help at all?
Yes, that is, I must say, very encouraging to hear that. And I think all smiles around. I hope other hotels, etc., experience the same thing. I have been saddened to read this morning that the Mount Nelson here in Cape Town, for example, had to let go of half of their staff, and they only consider opening in the beginning of next year.
Yeah, they will not be reopening. Yeah.
Oh, that is even
no, I'm saying they will
sadder.
I'm saying they won't be reopening now because of the limitation of 50. They are looking at possibly next year when the restrictions have been lifted.
Yes. So that ties in with the argument I made earlier. It is not only local travel that needs to be allowed, but also foreign travel.
Yeah.
And for local travel, it will take a while because people do book to go to the national parks and have other plans. But we must remember people's income are under pressure. And so they will think twice before booking an expensive holiday. They may shorten it relative to the past, or they may consider an alternative, only visiting family during their holiday, and that means a loss for the industry.
Yeah.
So if I look at the longer term, 1 year perspective, I am afraid that the demand for accommodation, hotels, etc., will remain weaker than what is supplied, and we will struggle with empty rooms, and probably hotels will have to offer quite good deals for people to take up on, but then you have to consider, is it viable financially to operate at that rate?
Q3, are we likely to see a notable bounce, or are we talking about what is called a protracted recovery of this sector?
I will say a long and a protracted recovery. For many hotels, they rely on business travel, and that is still a long way off. Then they have leisure travel, local leisure travel, and then they have foreign travel, and tourists arriving from the rest of the world. And all these will take a while to recover. I suspect in the next few years it will be difficult to match the levels we saw before COVID-19 started. So it is unfortunately not a pretty picture, an optimistic picture. And those that survived will definitely see a big bounce back now that the first guest starts arriving, but they have to make up for 5 months of no revenue, and then going forward they will really face strong competition and have pressure on room rates.
But let's look at that. I mean, it's not only inbound overseas tourists that we're looking at, but there are tourists here at home who normally don't travel at home. They always go out. And now with the borders locked, they are forced, I suppose, to spend that buck here at home. And that's quite a lucrative bunch of people because, I mean, they're used to spending in dollars overseas. Will that be sufficient?
Yes, you are raising a very good point, one I thought about previously but haven't considered now, and that is that we are now forced to consider all the options here in South Africa, not and not think just of an overseas trip, but overseas trips are, and many of these are limited to a small share of the population. Most people for their holiday is taking a bus or a taxi and visiting family and friends. And then if we consider most of our visitors from abroad is people traveling from our neighboring countries, and they are using buses, and they are important, especially when it gets to visiting family, but also overnight stays and shopping. And then you have your more premium markets where, the people you refer to, those that previously would have gone overseas, they now consider, have to consider doing a holiday here in South Africa. They partly compensate for the loss of the more high-spending visitors from Europe and the US, our second biggest market. And it will take a while for these, for our borders, international borders to open and the flights to resume, people to feel safe and adventurous again to travel and return. So unfortunately, it is a slow recovery, and something I hope businesses will be able to be sustained throughout this period to eventually reap the benefits. But it has been an enormous shock to the system.